Hello, everybody. Thanks for tuning in to yet another episode of Working Musicians Podcast. I'm your host, Dris Organica. And today, I've been drinking quite a bit of Grand Old Par, 12-year-old age blended Scotch whiskey. Blended because I'm on a budget today. No, I just got back from a little day trip, driving around the countryside, so to speak, checking out the scene in the country. And I got home. I'm like, you know what? I got exactly 23 more minutes before the liquor store closes, so I went ahead and got me a bottle of scotch. Why? Because I'm on vacation. And that's what I like to do when I'm on vacation, is drink scotch and live up the high life. Although, ironically, this episode is not brought to you by the high life. It is brought to you by Grand Old Par 12-year-old blended Scotch whiskey. See, it blends your words together. Isn't that nice? So I just got off the phone with a friend of mine, somebody who I've been talking about doing this podcast with, and I think it's going to come to fruition, or whatever that means. It's likely going to happen. So there's a good chance I'll be adding another member, whether permanently or here or there, to this podcast. And I think that's going to be great, because I think the more the merrier. But he's a cool guy, and I think people who have listened to the first few of these will agree that, hey, more, what is it they call it? The more the merrier, the more heads the better, whatever it's called. But at any rate, so it looks like I'll be adding a new guest member to this show, and I think it'll help fill it up a little bit more. But today, after I was talking with him, I got Jones and excited. I'm like, hey, this is cool. I may not have to be going this alone for the rest of the time. So I thought about something. Hey, what am I really passionate about? Well, I'm passionate about pre-production. I may have mentioned this in previous episodes. In fact, I'm pretty sure I have. So today I'm going to talk about pre-production. And this is something that I don't think you can possibly hear enough of. Pre-production. And it can go all the way, not just from your studio performances and your album debuts and all that stuff, but it's also important in your live show as well. But I think the premise and the majority of this episode is going to probably be about getting your music ready for the studio. But at the same time, this stuff can be applied for live performances and getting your music ready so that your live performance music is in tip-top shape. So, without further ado, let's get on with it. So, what exactly is pre-production? Well, it's a lot of things, and it's quite a few things, and it's not that many things all at once. The big thing to notice about pre-production is that if you were to just write a song, work it out, figure out the bass lines, in your head, and kind of perform it along each other, it doesn't work. It doesn't work very well unless you have other people who can work on it alongside you, all of which at the same time. Because until you've heard something played back at you, you don't really know how it sounds. And I hear occasionally guys sound, oh, this is exactly the sound I had in my head. No, it's not. Never have I found the exact sound I was listening to in my head. And case in point, how many times have you heard your guitar player or drummer or something like that going, no, man, the drums need to be like, boo, pa, pa, boo, 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 pa, 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 boo, yeah, that's my pathetic version of beatboxing, right? But the point is, that's what they're hearing in their head. They can't even perform it the way it's in their head, beatboxing. You think there's any chance in hell that they know exactly how it's going to sound, or that's the exact sound they're looking for? They really don't. Because on its own merit, a single track by itself is very seldomly the same as what it's going to be in a full mix of your album or your live show. But once again, I'm mostly talking about pre-production in the realm of getting your songs ready to go to the studio. So this is kind of where I'm going with this. until you've heard your music played back at you, you don't really understand how it sounds. So how do you get your music prepared to where it's exactly, or as close to it, let's be realistic, as close to it as you want it to be? And the answer to this is you don't know until you start, right? So I'm going to kind of go through a basic strategy that anybody can do to really get their pre-production in tip-top shape so that when they go to record their album, they're confident that what they're doing is going to work. In fact, you'll know it's going to work, right? And you'll find that oftentimes the direction you go is not the initial idea you had in your head, and it's oftentimes nowhere even close, right? And it's for a number of reasons, which I will explain. But to get there, let's start with ground one. What do you need to really do good pre-production? Well, if you're like a lot of songwriters, you kind of need a little bit of gear just to get you going. It doesn't have to cost a lot, about $200, less if you go on the used market, or even less if you go on the really inferior new market, which I would just stay away from. But, something along the lines of a good old trusted, tried and true $150 name brand audio interface, and something along the lines of a SM57, an Audix i5, AT2020, whatever seems to make the most sense for what you're doing. That's all you really need to get this up and running. In fact, they've even got these little Zoom handheld recorders, which I don't advise for just the sake of pre-production. They're great just to get an idea laid down quickly, in the heat of the moment. But if you've got a place where you're writing music, what does it take to add a little $100 USB interface, a cable, and a microphone to your setup, just so that you can record what you're doing and actually get serious about writing music and about writing songs for your upcoming album, single, EP, whatever release, however you plan on doing it. So you got to have a little bit of a nominal amount of money invested in your gear. You need some kind of an interface that's at least decent. You need a cable that will carry a signal, and you need a microphone. And I would even recommend getting a microphone stand and a clip to hold your microphone. But all this stuff can be purchased for a pretty, small amount of money when it's all said and done. Because if you're planning on going to a studio and spending money on that, you'd be a fool to not spend the $200-300 up front so that you can do your own pre-production. Because if you go into a studio blind as to what things are sounding like because you've never recorded it and heard it played back to you, there's a good chance you're going to end up wasting way more money on this, because doing pre-production work in a studio is expensive. Doing it at home, it's a one-time fee. So I'm not going to get on a soapbox or tangent about talking about what you need, but realistically, something along the lines of a $100 microphone of good quality or decent quality. I would recommend a dynamic. The only thing about this is if you get a dynamic, there's a good chance the preamps on your little $100 interface might not be up to snuff. So maybe you might want to go ahead and go with a condenser on this. But I would recommend an audio interface that has 60 or so decibels of gain on it, so that you can actually push a dynamic microphone. Because in my experience, dynamic microphones are reign superior for pre-production work. Largely because A, they're cheap, rugged, durable, they don't require phantom power, and best of all, they don't pick up a whole lot of background noise, and they pretty much work in any environment you have. So you can go outside and do pre-production if that's what it calls for. Or be in an area where you've got a little bit of noise, right, and it's okay. So that's why I recommend dynamic microphones for pre-production. But now that we've gotten that out of the way, let's start from ground one, the song idea. So you've been hacking away at the guitar keyboards or whatever you write your music on. You've kind of got a vocal line figured out. You've got the structure of the song worked out. It's got the chorus. It's got a verse. It's got an intro that starts like this. After intro, verse, chorus, bridge, and then you end with the chorus and double it. Play it, twice as long as you did in the other previous two choruses. A quick little 8-bar outro. Then you're done. So you've got the song basically written, right? You've got an idea for how the vocal melody goes. You don't necessarily have the words down. That's when you're really, really ready to start doing your pre-production. Now, I know everybody's different. Me personally, I'm kind of a singer-songwriter, so I pretty much do everything myself. Now, I can't play the drums or the damn, so I usually get somebody to play those for me. Somebody who I plan on getting on this show. Maybe I just need to let them have their baby first so that they can have time for this, and that's understandable. But definitely, I know a very good drummer who I think a lot of y'all would get a lot of inspiration and good knowledge from. And on top of that, he's just a really cool guy. But, I've got a pretty much a go-to drummer that I use for when I need real drums. Now, on my EP, Feet of Strength, I did all programmed drums. It wasn't ideal in some ways, but I think it worked fine for what I was going for. But there are some instances where that is just not going to work. Don't waste your time. But at least getting, using a drum program, it will at least get you there. So in addition to that small nominal investment, which I talked about of, an audio interface, a microphone and a cable, microphone stand and a microphone clip, right? I also think it's worth the money to spend, whatever it costs to get a drum program like Addictive Drums, Easy Drummer, Steven Slate, Superior Drummer. There are more, but those are the only ones I can think of off the top of my head. I personally use Addictive Drums. Why? Because I got them for like next to nothing quite a few years ago. I haven't updated it. I don't have the new packages. Although I think when I got it, they had another deal. I have quite a few packages for it. I'm not sure if that's what comes standard or what, but at any rate, I found that it just seems to work fine for what I need. But pretty much, you've got your song idea down. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, you're a guitar player. You're playing acoustic, right? So you've got that all figured out, the acoustic lines. You've got a rough idea for how the vocal melody should go. You got some words kind of in your head. Now it's time to start your pre-production. So what I recommend everybody do from here is first get the tempo down. And I think the best way to do this is get your drum program. And some DAWs even come with this stuff. It doesn't have to be the world's most realistic sounding drums. It's okay. You're just trying to get ideas on paper, so to speak, so that you can be objective. So go through the presets, find a drum loop that seems to work pretty good for the song. And if you realize that, hey, you need to completely change the drum loop or add this or that, do a light little bit of drum programming just to get so that it makes sense for when you're tracking and playing along with it, that's fine. I found that 50% of the time I can put the drum loop and just have it go for 15 minutes and I can play along with it and it doesn't matter. Now, there are some instances where it's just like, hey, it just changed time signature. Clearly this 4/4 beat's not going to work now that I'm in 3/4. Or there's a major tempo change that you might need to put in a marker and increase the tempo in your DAW so that when you're playing along to it, it makes sense. Or you might just need to change the structure of the beat a little bit so that it makes more sense. Because sometimes it's complete garbage when you're using a drum loop all the way through verse, chorus, bridge, intro, outro. It just doesn't work. But I'm willing to bet you'll find more often than not a simple drum loop that's somewhat in the realm or in the general vicinity of what you would use for the actual drum beat of the song is good enough to get you through this process, right? So you found a drum loop that works for your song, right? You kind of get the tempo dialed in, playing along with it. Oh, that's a little fast. It's amazing what just 2 to 4 beats a minute will do to the impact of your song. It's kind of funny because sometimes you'll begin to realize, hey, I'm speeding up really bad in the chorus and it's not actually adding anything to the music. So, you play along to the drum beat until you've got it down at least well enough to where you can get through the song, right? Now you're ready to start recording that guitar line. So give yourself a good 8 or so bars in the beginning of the drum loop and then start playing count 9 or so and play along through until you've got all the guitar parts from the intro to the outro, all the way from the beginning to end, and stop there. At that point, I think it's a good idea to listen through it once and make sure that, hey, this makes sense. There's no major issues like, hey, I'm so far off beat that I can't do vocals over this. But more than likely, if you notice that you'll notice that while you're tracking it, and you'll just stop, either punch in or start over from the beginning. Usually on stuff like this, if you can't get through all the way through the song in one take, at least well enough to get the idea across without completely jacking it up, you need to practice the song some more because you're not ready to even begin pre-production. But assuming you've got it to where you can get through the guitar line and, 1, 2, 3 takes, that's fine. But just get through it to where you're on beat and you're playing to the drum loop. Right? Listen back to it and start practicing your vocal line over that. It's amazing how you'll find how oftentimes just like you begin to realize so quickly that the vocal line doesn't make sense now that you're not playing at the same time, because we have a tendency to kind of vary our rhythms a little bit when we're playing and singing at the same time. And that's perfectly normal and acceptable. There are some of the songs I do, like if I play it and sing it at the same time, I have to play them a little bit differently just because for whatever reason, I'm just not talented enough, or the rhythms are just don't quite lock in at the same rate that my hands and mouth can move at the same time. That's okay. But realize that there's a good chance that if that's how you think the guitars need to sound, you might need to change up the vocal line a little bit just to make it lock in with that, or, kind of pocket it a little bit. But, if it sounds right in the room when you're singing along to your drum loop and your guitar line, you're probably in pretty good shape, right? So at least you know that, hey, at least my vocal line is close to where it needs to be. Now, obviously, you're going to have to probably tweak some things in the end because vocals are the most important thing you do. So I'm not going to even say, don't even bother recording them. Just know that you get through it and say that, okay, the vocals are, at least 70% of the way there. I'm good enough. All right. Move on to the bass. Now, generally speaking, the reason why I say don't go ahead and record your vocals now is because once you start fiddling around with the bass, your whole world changes. Bass is such an underrated instrument in the value of a song, because without the bass, you really don't understand how the song sounds. And I tell you, it's so amazing what adding bass to a drum loop and a guitar line can do for the direction of a song. And it's amazing how there's a lot of times once I start playing along with the bass, so I get something I think I like on bass, I go ahead and record it. And for whatever reason, I begin to realize, oh man, it sure would be cool if I would have done this on the guitar, right? Sometimes I go ahead and do a quick overdub so that the guitar line reflects this. Sometimes I don't. Sometimes I just keep a mental memory of it, because at the end of the day, this is all scratch. I'm not going to use any of this. I'm just using this as a tool to get my musical composition where it needs to be so that it's shown in the correct light. Now, a tendency that I have on bass, and I think a lot of other people do too, is usually the first thing you come up with on bass is not the right idea for the song. For whatever reason, when I get on the bass, I just have a blast. It's so fun. You don't have to worry about mic placement. You just plug it right into your DI box, into your interface, and you're recording. You're listening to it on the monitors. It's stress-free because you're not having to worry about mics and bleed and all that stuff. It's just, I think, one of the funnest parts of not just recording, but definitely in pre-production, because it so changes the direction of the song that you take. And just by, the fundamental notes you play, it really has a tendency to change the way you perceive your song, or at least the way you perceived it when you first wrote it. And you find avenues that you can go down that will just blow your mind. So once you fiddle around with it and get a bass part that you like, get ahead and get it in there. Record it, listen to it a few times, kind of sing over it. You might begin to realize that, hey, the way I did this chorus, it's 80% of the way there, but I need to syncopate it a little bit more. I just need to hold this chord longer. I need to do little things. Go ahead. You've got your little pre-production studio at your fingertips. Go ahead, overdub it to where it sounds right. It doesn't have to be perfect. It can be a little jagged in the transitions. That's fine. This is for your benefit and your benefit only. No one else is going to hear this unless you have other band members that, where you're writing the song and they just pretty much come along with it, learn the parts, and you guys go to the studio. That's fine. But once you've got your meat and potatoes guitars recorded, you've got your drum loop, and you've got your bass line down, start working with some alternative ideas that you can do with guitar lines. Because once you get that bass in there, it's like, oh man, this would be so cool if I were to kind of follow along with just a light palm muted chord along with what the bass doing. It's doing, man, it should be cool if I had a lead off into the left while I'm holding the fundamental chord off on the right side. Experiment with it. If it sounds right in the room, it's probably right. Record it. And then once you've recorded all these layers, add and take away until you think, hey, this is pretty cool. And once you get to where you're nodding your head to it and it's just, this sounds cool. Obviously it's flawed. The performances are crap, but you get the idea and you're getting excited about it. That's the time where you need to start really focusing on those vocals. So you've already kind of had an idea, you've run through the vocal line just when you recorded your guitars over the drum loop, played back, but now you've got the bass added to it. You may have even edited the guitars a little bit, done a punch in or two here and there just to kind of make everything a little bit tighter, make it make more sense within the beat and the rhythm. And so now you're doing the vocals and it's just, you begin to realize, hey, I thought I had written the vocals as they need to be. Now I need to change them up a little bit just to make it make sense. So you're singing along to it. Okay. Yeah, I don't know the words very well. And half the time it sounds like I'm mumbling, but that's fine. Go ahead. And if it sounds right in the room, it's probably pretty close to where it needs to be. So go ahead and record it. Now, this is where I think a lot of people get stuck. People seem to think that a good singer hears something and instantly sings it perfectly. That doesn't make any sense. Even a good guitar player has to hear something a few times, run through it a couple times to where they feel comfortable with it and they're not having to overly think about what the next chord change is. The same thing goes with your vocals, right? So don't expect it to be perfect. Expect it to be a little out of time, a little out of pitch. That's to be expected. But if it's so bad to where you can't concentrate on the music after that point, then yeah, you probably need to work on them a little bit more. And that's fine. Every vocalist is different. If you need to practice it, and come back to it the next day, that's totally fine. But we're just getting ideas on paper here, guys. So don't be overcritical of yourself. It's not that important. The point is this is benefiting you, right? So get your vocals to where you think they sound good, or at least good enough to where obviously the performances will be flawed, a little offbeat, a little out of time, a little out of pitch. That's fine. But go ahead and get those in there. All right, record them and listen back to them constructively, taking out the performance issues as much as you possibly can. And you'll likely notice that there's little things you do naturally, like your inflections, that just the way you sing things or come into the note or you hold the note off or the way you bend that vowel in the vocal line, that it just doesn't work or it sounds really cool and you should embellish it a bit more. Play around with those ideas. Get it to where you think it sounds really good, right? Even if you don't go and completely re-record it, you've got an idea for where you need to go with that song. Now, I think if there's some dramatic performance issues where you realize that, hey, the way I held this note is completely wrong, go ahead and re-record the vocal line. Start working on backup harmonies. If you begin to realize, hey, this guitar lead was okay, but now that I add the vocal line in there, I need to make it a little bit more different or more similar to what the vocals are doing to make it contrast or fit better within the context of the song. That's fine, because it is very, very difficult to hear all these little things in your head. It is much easier to hear them, the problems, what does and doesn't work when it's played back at you. And just keep going through this process until you think, hey, I'm pretty much there, right? So once you've got all these ideas on paper, save the file and come back to it at, a day or two later. Listen to it on the car on your way to work and kind of sing along with it. Hey, this is where it needs to be. And at the very least, you've got something that you can kind of follow up on. And from there, you might be 90% of the way there, but you notice, hey, there's a few little things I need to do to make this better. And that's okay, right? Because we're in the pre-production phase. Now, if you want to take this one step further, you can even go so far as to, okay, now that I've got the composition of the song done and I know exactly what my performances need to sound like, that's when you need to start focusing on tone. And I think it's one of those things where, like, early on, this is harder to do than it is later on, because once you kind of have your sound developed for where it's like, look, I attach this microphone in pretty much this place and it sounds good for my style of music. Hey, that for whatever reason, this microphone tends to work good on my voice with this preamp, or just, I tend to sound better if I'm 2 feet away from the mic. I tend to sound better if I'm 2 inches from the mic, or whatever. You start working on tone selection, and every song's going to be a little bit different. And in today's world, I think it's so cool because if you're doing like electric guitars, these little guitar simulators, well, I don't really recommend them for a full length recording or doing any real recording, other than maybe like, hey, after the fact, you realize, oh, it would sure sound cool if I would add this little part to help fill up the void. That's different. Or if you need a quick counter melody and it's something you just need to do on the quick before you because you've already recorded it, and it's just like, okay, I just need this quick little lead just to tie everything together. That's fine. A guitar synth simulator will work just fine for that. But what they're really good for is giving you an idea of the tone you need to use, right? So you may have an amp or two, but being able to play around with the sounds in the guitar amp simulator can really give you a good insight as to what kind of sounds you need to be looking for in the amp you're using. And if the amp and effects pedals or whatever you use, guitar even, aren't what really does the song the most justice, start networking and looking to see if somebody has that. That's great. You've got that Mesa Boogie triple rectifier. But if the sound you need is from a Fender amp, you're not going to get that from a Mesa. Just like if the sound you need is a Mesa, but you've got a Fender, start networking. See if you can find something that's closer to it. Even if it's just going from a Fender amp to another brand that's a little bit better for heavy rock or vice versa or anything. But start looking into your tone, into sounds, not so much in the quality, but in just more so the differences and how they sound and what you need to make your material sound the best. Same thing goes with bass. Now, I will say at the very least, with bass, I think you can get away much more so with using bass amp synths and going the DI route than you can with electric or acoustic guitars. Big time. But I found that there have been times where, I never would have guessed that the best direction for a song to go would be to use a very heavy DI acoustic guitar tone. But maybe a couple months ago, I was doing some pre-production on one of my songs, and I began to realize, wow, I would have never guessed that. But you know what? The best direction I think for this song to go is to use a very heavy DI tone. Now I'm going to blend a little bit of microphone tone in there just to make it sound a little bit more realistic and natural. But for whatever reason, this DI tone is great. Like, why mess with it? It's not quite there. It's not quite believable enough, but it's 80-90% of the way there. I just need to layer in a little bit of microphone sounds, and this is going to sound great. Most of the time, that is not the case, especially when you're dealing with acoustic guitar. I'll always record the DI signal with it, and I found it to be very useful with blending in other sounds with your acoustic stuff, just because it gives you options where otherwise you'd be stuck. If all you had was the mic'd acoustic guitar, you begin to realize, man, I really need something that's more of I just need to add a little bit of like a wah sound to this to kind of make it make more sense or to kind of beef it up. You've got options with that DI signal, but that's the time you need to start figuring out your tones, not after you've already recorded the song and you hand it off to the mixing engineer and said, make it great, because there is such a thing as tying a mix engineer's hands, just as there is such a thing as giving them too many options. But if you don't give your mix engineer a fail safe, you're not going to have one. If when push comes to shove, there's a good chance at some point in one of your songs, you're going to need that DI track just to make your music all that it can be. But if you go in there knowing that, hey, I will need a DI track to help beef up this acoustic guitar, or hey, for whatever reason, this sound, I would have never guessed, but this is the sound I need to make this song come to life, and I don't own a piece of equipment to make it get there. You might be able to just take some of that amp simulator sound, blend it with your regular amp sound, and get it there. It's amazing, but you won't know this until you've practiced it and tried it in your pre-production. So once again, just one of the many invaluable things you can do in pre-production to help make your final production as professional as it possibly can be, because by the time you get to the studio, you need to know exactly what you need to do to get your sound there. And something else to take it just yet another step further is start looking at mic placement. For whatever reason, and not just mic placement, but microphone choices. But there's some myths going out there that, if you're recording electric guitars and snare drums and this, that, and the other thing, you use a dynamic microphone. If you're doing acoustic guitar or vocals, you use a condenser. And you'll begin to realize, man, if you fall into that, I'm not saying you will be wrong more times than you're not, but a lot of people tend to sound better on random microphones. Using a U87 on your vocals is likely going to give you a decent sound, but you might be surprised when that much cheaper dynamic microphone like the SM7B, which costs, 10 times less, is a tenth the price. For whatever reason, it sounds better on your voice in the context of that song. Now, something else to take into consideration, if you're doing this on a track-by-track basis and all singles, it's not as important. But if you're doing a full-length album, you want your vocals to make sense from one song to the other, so you might have to make compromises on one song to the next. But that's not something you're going to really understand until you've done your pre-production on all your songs and begin to realize, hey, I need to make compromises on my microphone selection or my tone selections, because you might feel like being in two completely opposite ends of the spectrum on one album might not do you justice. There's a pretty good chance you're right. You don't want to stray too far from one song to the next, but you don't want them to all be the exact same. So, variety is the spice of life, but too much spice, overpowers the food. So once again, start looking at microphone placements and selections. And what do I mean by placements? Well, if you happen to notice that the song you're doing, for example, in the verse, it might sound better if you have a more distant mic set up, and for what it's something that needs to be a little bit lighter and in the background, not as prominent. But when the chorus comes in, it needs to be up front and in your face. Sure, there's some mix tricks you can do. You can play a little harder, you can turn it up, but nothing will take the place of mic placement in that scenario. There's a lot of times where, if you begin to realize, hey, for whatever reason, having a mic 3 feet back from my amp cab or from my acoustic guitar or whatever is a sound that works best on these scenarios. But when it comes to this scenario, I need that mic that's 2 inches off the cab, or 6 inches from the 10th fret of my acoustic guitar. That's the kind of stuff you want to figure out in pre-production, so that when it comes time to go in the studio, you can tell your recording engineer, hey, I've done my pre-production, and I think the best way to go would be to have a microphone like this, 6 inches from the 10th fret, and then another microphone two feet back, aimed at the 10th fret as well. Just whatever it takes. You might begin to realize that you need stereo miking to make this thing make sense, and the space will vary depending on song to song. But generally speaking, you'll figure this stuff out. And once you understand what works for pretty much all your material, you just basically have to get it set up to where, you just go, if you're doing 5 songs in a row in one day, it's like, hey, this is the overall mic setup that I need to capture all the different songs. There are going to be certain parts where you're not going to use this microphone. There's going to be certain songs you won't use any, 3 of the microphones on my acoustic guitar, just a mono mic, 2 feet away is fine. But you'll know this going into the studio, so you get it set up once and you're good. That way you have some very good detailed notes and direction that you can give your mix engineer, because it may or may not be the same person who's tracking you. And no mix engineer should have a problem with a guy who comes in there and says, hey, I've done my homework. This is how I want it to sound. These are the mics I want you to use. Unless there's a glaring reason for why they think you shouldn't. And it's usually because for some reason, something is completely degrading the sound, right? Because believe it or not, your recording and mix engineers don't want you to sound bad. They want everything you do to sound as good as possible, because if you don't sound good, they don't sound good, right? But going in there knowing what you need to make your music come to life is going to empower your engineers to give you the best product that they possibly can, which at the end of the day is their end goal as well as yours. So, I've talked about the importance of using pre-production for composition. I've talked about the little bit of gear you're going to need to really make this happen. Talked about the importance of going through there and adding and subtracting, playing along with stuff, and being open to changing the direction of what your initial thought was to better the music. I also talked about, some things you can do for tone selection, talked about mic placement, right? But there is one last thing I think to really do pre-production and do it right that you should probably do. A rough mix. When I say a rough mix, this is what I mean. I'm not talking about just bringing the levels up so that everything is kind of in this about the same volume as close to the volumes you would want it to be on the final product. I'm talking about going through there and actually doing a mix. Even if you have to pay someone, say, hey, don't spend more than 30 minutes on this. Just give me a quick mix of how the final, so I can have an idea of what the final product's going to sound like, right? And if you begin to, your an idea was to have this big lush reverb, and you get it played back to you and you realize, oh, this reverb thing doesn't work. What I really need is a delay. Or I thought that, this mono microphone acoustic guitar would be good, but it's just getting buried by everything else. Maybe I need to do a stereo miking technique and soft pan them just to make it cut through the mix a little bit better. There are certain things you're not going to really realize until you've done a rough mix. Now, I'm not talking about going for broke, but it is a good idea to, at least get your mix to a point to where it's kind of in the ballpark of what your finished product is going to sound like, so that when you hear your rough mix played back to you of your pre-production track, you're like, okay, I get it. Not only is my composition there, but I know how it needs to sound. So when I go and start practicing this stuff on my own, before I hit the studio, I know exactly how I need to do this. It's like, okay, the guitar part lines, I need to do things, play them a little bit differently. Not so much different chords, different notes, different rhythms, more so the way you play it, how you attack the note, how you release, the strings you use, all these kinds of things, all the way down to pick choice, the heads you use, the kind of sounds, the room sounds you want. It might be one of those things where, you had this idea of this big kind of hall sound for your song or album, but you begin to realize that it just doesn't work. So once you hear that in the context of a rough mix, you begin to realize, hey, really, this thing sounds much better when it's, not very wet and almost to the point that it's almost too dry. That actually makes for a better listening experience. Once again, something you're not going to really know until you've heard it played back. And then one final piece of advice I would really recommend for people who are serious about pre-production so that they get the best product possible is with your vocals. Well, I'll be the first one to tell you that auto-tune is used way too much. There is nothing wrong with taking a performance, a scratch track of your vocals, pitch correcting them, all right? So that when you're practicing along and when you're hearing it, you're hearing them in the correct pitches. Because if you're practicing along to, and your mind has heard your pre-production track with out-of-tune vocals, there's a very good chance that when you get into the studio, you're going to sing it the exact same way, and that's not what you want. So perhaps something that might be a good idea if you're a singer like me who doesn't usually nail it in pre-production vocals. I never nail my vocals in pre-production because I'm always poorly rehearsed. I'm just getting the ideas on paper. But, once you've got that rough mix in there, I think it's a pretty good idea to go back over it and go over your vocals with a fine-tooth comb. Big time. All the way down to you completely re-record them to where you have all the way you come in, your attacks, your releases, when and how you bend and crack the note, when you kind of growl, when you lay low, how much breath and airiness you add. That's the kind of stuff you really need to nail. Everything else is pretty inconsequential so long as it's not like glaringly wrong. You can get away with the guitar being slightly off out of time, or the drums kind of rushing a little bit into a transition. A lot of this stuff actually sounds good. It's natural. A good musician's going to speed up and slow down and play a little behind, a little forward. It's just a good musician has this idea of has a good natural timing about them and knows how to play to the pocket, right? That's a good musician. But with vocals, you begin to realize very quickly that If they're not right, it's going to be obvious, and it's going to take a lot more time to edit them to get them to really blend and sound smooth and sound professional. You know, you don't want to go for over process necessarily, but I think it's a good idea to where after you've got that final, that rough mix of your pre-production, go back over the vocals, re-record them, and get them to where it's like, okay, the performance is there, the pitches are a little off, that's fine. Go through there with your pitch correcting program and get those vocals in tune. That's fine if they're a little bit robotic at times. If you were, you know, 2 notes off, 2 notes too low on the high note at the end, of course, it's going to sound a little robotic, but that's okay, because the important thing is that your ear needs to hear this correctly, because I'm telling you, if you just take the step of pitch correcting your vocals, hearing it many times, and then singing along to it to where you're in pitch and in key, once by the time you get to the studio doing your final vocals, it's easy, because the vibe is already built for you. The pitch is there. You know exactly how it needs to be performed. I mean, down to the minutia of when you take a breath, and you're well rehearsed because you've sang it several hundred times before you got to that studio. You're going to nail it in 1, 2, 3 takes. And let's say you flub a little bit in one chorus. That's fine. That's what the other takes are for. But I've noticed that if I follow this exercise, usually I can take an entire vocal take. Even if there's some slight imperfections, it's okay. Because, you know, a slight out of tune entrance into the chorus or a verse or this, that, and the other thing can easily be fixed with a light bit of pitch correction. Not to say you want to apply the auto-tune T-Pain effect to your entire track, but, you know, it's to be expected that on a modern production, unless you are just a phenomenal singer, realize that most people are using pitch correction in their vocals. You'll notice that today's vocals are perfect in pitch. That is not natural. There are very few people who can do this, and there are very few instances in music where this really sounds the best. It's okay to be a little off. I mean, take a guy like Hank Williams Jr., listen to some of his stuff. It's clearly he's a good singer, but he clearly sings things a little off pitch and out of key, a little off time to add to the song. It just makes a lot more sense, right? So realize that being a little bit off in the vocals may not kill things, but sometimes they just might need a little bit of help to kind of fit them within the realm of what your ear hears is acceptable and what your ear hears is wrong. And often, contrary to popular belief, every note in a chord, if they are perfectly in tune, does not sound right. It's kind of crazy. And depending on how the chord is structured, and I'm not a music theorist, but believe it or not, if you play every note in a chord 100% perfect in tune, it doesn't sound quite right. You actually need for, let's say the root to be right in tune, the third to be a little flat, and then the fifth to be a little sharp. If memory serves me right, that's kind of the formula for how to get a 1-3-5 chord to lock perfectly in tune. Now, generally, we do this by ear because if you begin to notice there's some waves in a chord or in a vocal line in context to the music, your ear automatically hears this and knows it's wrong. But there are a lot of times when I've found that, by adding pitch correction, it actually made the performance worse, right? Except for in these 4 areas where I just was flat out not in the right tune. But other than that, the performance was great. Go with it because, if you've got a good mix engineer, they're going to identify these things and they're going to only fix what they feel needs to be corrected to make it work. They're not just going to apply automatic settings and make you sound like Akon or T-Pain, you know what I mean, or Cher. That's not what a good mix engineer is going to do to you. But, using pitch correction to help fine tune a performance is completely different than using pitch correction to get things just to sound somewhat in tune, completely different animals. You won't notice the pitch correction if it's just to kind of lift the note just a tad, because it was, just a little bit sharp, or a little flat, moving it just to where it locks the pitch into where exactly it needs to be. Because even without it, it might have been close, but once you get it locked into exactly where it needs to be, whether that pitch is sharp or flat, it'll make that chord lock in and sound pretty close to perfect. So there's a lot of ways you can use software that a lot of us, tend to look down our noses at, like pitch correction, whether it be the wave stuff, auto-tune, Melodyne. There's several of them out there. Don't be afraid to use those in your pre-production, because I guarantee you, if you hear yourself your vocals being played back in tune, and that's what you practice along with, in your final vocal takes, they will naturally be more in tune. Your ear is an amazing organ, or if that's what it is. But when you hear things correctly, you tend to replicate them correctly. If you hear things wrong, you tend to replicate them wrong. And like I said, I personally use a little bit of pitch correction in my final tracks, but when I say a little bit, I'm not kidding. Like when it comes to vocal editing, by the time I do a vocal line for editing purposes in a final track, it's very minor stuff. It's things like controlling how hard I come into the compressor, little things like that, so that it's smooth and glossy, and there's not too many like spikes and peaks, but to the point where it's not so perfect that it sounds fake and unsincere and just not natural. So it's a fine line, but the average person who's any bit decent with mixing and editing, they're going to do this naturally without having to really think about it. Because if it sounds good, it is good, right? So there's just a little bit of things that I think we can do for the little bit of investment in gear, just so that we can get our music and our performances to as good as we possibly can, so that when we get to that studio, or we get to that to the time of doing our final takes, we are prepared, and that there's very little in the way of guessing as to how things are going to sound, to where when you go into that studio, you should know how things are going to sound, right? They're going to sound like your pre-production, just much better, much cleaner, and much more polished. And they're going to sound amazing because your pre-production already sounds good. Now your final production sounds great. All right, guys, thanks for listening, and I'll check y'all next time. Bye.